My name is Renata Kowalski, and I was 34 years old the week my appendix nearly killed me, and my parents packed my childhood bedroom into 11 cardboard boxes. I worked as a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Erie, Pennsylvania, the kind of job where you learn to read contracts the way other people read weather. I noticed clauses. I noticed omissions. I noticed the difference between what a document said and what it was trying to make you believe. I did not, at the time, think to apply any of that skill to my own family. That takes a particular kind of blindness, the kind that only love can produce. I was living 40 minutes from my parents' house then, in a rented duplex with a leaking kitchen faucet I kept meaning to fix. But I still had a room at their place. Not a guest room, my room. Twin bed against the east wall, the same dresser I'd had since I was 9. A bulletin board still pinned with ribbons from a science fair I'd won in 6th grade. My parents, Helena and Edmund Kowalski, had always said the door was open. "This will always be your home, Rennie," my mother used to tell me, usually while patting the quilt on my bed like she was blessing it. On a Tuesday in March, my appendix ruptured at my desk. I remember the pain arriving like a hand closing around something inside me, and I remember apologizing to my coworker for interrupting her lunch. I spent 9 days in the hospital. The rupture had caused an infection, and the infection had turned into something the doctors watched carefully, murmuring words like sepsis in a tone that made my chest go cold. My parents visited twice. My cousin Dominic visited 0 times, but that didn't stop him from measuring my bedroom for a bed frame on day 6. I found out on day 8, propped up against a hospital pillow with an 4 taped into the back of my hand, when my mother sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed and told me, in the gentle voice she used for bad news, that Dominic needed somewhere to stay while he got back on his feet, and that my room was simply the most practical option, and that surely I understood, and that nothing had been thrown away, everything was in the garage, safe and dry. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the ribbons on the bulletin board. I thought about the 11 boxes, a number I would only later confirm was exact, because my mother has always been precise about small numbers and vague about large ones. "Okay," I said. That single word would turn out to be the last time I let anyone move through my life without asking me first. This is the story of how a locked bedroom door taught me more about my family than 18 years of unlocked ones ever had, and how I learned slowly and without raising my voice, to make sure it never happened again. Before I go back to the beginning, if you're the kind of person who's ever had a family member decide your life around a kitchen table without you in the room, you already know the particular ache I'm describing. I'd love to hear your version of it in the comments. I read every one. And if stories like this keep you company on long drives or quiet evenings, consider subscribing. This channel is for people who got tired of being the reasonable one and decided that being reasonable and being a doormat are not actually the same thing. Now let me take you back to where it started. The house on Larchmont Avenue. I grew up on Larchmont Avenue, in a brick 2-story with green shutters that my father, Edmund, repainted every 4 years whether they needed it or not. He was a maintenance supervisor for the Erie School District, a man who believed that a well-kept gutter was a form of moral character. My mother, Helena, worked the front desk at a pediatric dental office for 26 years, and knew the names of every child who'd ever cried in that waiting room. I was the only child for the first 9 years of my life, and then, unofficially, I wasn't. My Aunt Basha, my mother's younger sister, married a man named Tomasz Wach who drank more than he worked and worked less every year that passed. They had one son, my cousin Dominic, born the same year as me, for months apart, which our grandmother liked to call practically twins, in a tone that suggested this was a compliment to both of us, though it never quite felt that way to me. Dominic was, by every account, a charming child. He had my aunt's easy laugh and my uncle's gift for walking into a room and immediately becoming its center. I was quieter. I read. I organized my books by color and then, later, by author, and I remember my mother laughing to a neighbor once, not unkindly. Renata was born 40 years old. The trouble in Aunt Beija's house started early and never really stopped. Uncle Tomasz lost his job at the plant when I was 11, and after that there was always a reason Dominic needed something: new shoes, a field trip fee, a winter coat, and there was always a reason my mother had it ready before Aunt Basha finished asking. I didn't resent this as a child. I didn't understand it as a pattern yet. I only noticed the way children notice things without naming them, that when Dominic forgot his lunch my mother handed him half of mine without asking me first, And that when I forgot mine I ate crackers from the vending machine because we didn't have money for that today, Rennie. The pattern had a name by the time I was in my 20s, though nobody in my family ever used it. My mother called it helping family. My father called it doing right by Basha, because she's had it hard. Nobody called it what a stranger looking in from outside might have called it. Keeping the ledger permanently unbalanced, and always in the same direction. I want to be fair here because fairness is the whole reason I'm telling this story the way I am. My Aunt Basha was not a villain. She was a woman who married young, married badly, and spent 3 decades trying to make a broken thing look whole for the sake of her son. My Uncle Tomasz was not cruel, only weak, the kind of weak that curdles into resentment when it isn't corrected. And Dominic was a child who learned the way all children learn, that the fastest way to get what he needed was to let someone else feel guilty for having more. That lesson would end up costing me a bedroom, a great deal of money, and very nearly a relationship with my own parents. But in March of the year I turned 9, it only cost me half a peanut butter sandwich, and I didn't think about it again for a long time. The family we chose to ignore. Let me introduce the rest of the people who filled the rooms of my childhood, because you'll need to know them the way I knew them before you can understand what they became. My grandmother, Zofia Nowak, was the one who held the family together in the old-fashioned way, meaning she was the one everyone was afraid of disappointing. She was 78 the year I was hospitalized, still living alone in the house on Poplar Street where my mother and Aunt Basha had grown up, still hosting Sunday dinner every week like it was a job she'd never been permitted to retire from. Zofia believed in 3 things: God, family obligation, and the idea that airing grievances in front of other people was a sin roughly on par with theft. She loved me. She loved Dominic. She loved the peace in her dining room more than either of us, and she would spend the next 2 decades proving it. My father's brother, Uncle Henryk Kowalski, was a quieter presence, a retired postal worker, twice divorced, who showed up to holidays with a casserole and left before dessert. He liked me. He thought Dominic was, in his words, a con man in sneakers, but he never said this to my parents, because Henrik's rule in life was that other people's children were other people's business. Then there was my father's sister, Aunt Christina, married to a dentist named Walter, the wealthiest branch of the family and the one everyone quietly resented and quietly courted at the same time. Christina and Walter had 2 daughters, my cousins Anya and Marta, both a few years younger than me, both raised in a house with a pool and a housekeeper, both destined to become, at various points in this story, unlikely allies. And there was Dominic. I should tell you more about him now because he is, in his way, the second main character of this story, even though for most of it he doesn't realize he's in one. Dominic Walk was born gifted with the kind of charisma that makes teachers forgive late homework and makes aunts slip him $20 bills for gas. He was not stupid, he was, if anything, sharper than people gave him credit for, sharp enough to understand exactly which levers moved which people. He understood, for instance, that Grandma Zofia's guilt over Aunt Beja's hard marriage could be redirected, gently and repeatedly, into cash. He understood that my mother's fear of being seen as the sister who didn't help could be worked like a tap. He was not, I want to be clear, plotting this as a child. Children rarely plot. But children do learn what works, and by the time Dominic was 16, what worked for him had become a permanent operating system. By the time we were 17, the pattern had a shape I could finally see, even if I still didn't have the vocabulary for it. Dominic got a car for his birthday, a used Corolla that Aunt Basha couldn't afford, paid for in part, I'd learned decades later, by a loan from my parents that was never written down and never repaid. I got a car for my 18th birthday too, 6 months later. A 10-year-old Honda with 140,000 miles that my father found through a coworker, bought with money I'd saved myself from 2 years of hosting at a diner on Peach Street. My parents were proud of me for that. They told me so often. Renata worked for everything she has, my mother would say to other relatives, in a tone that I only understood much later was not entirely a compliment to me. It was also quietly an excuse. If I could do it myself, then Dominic needing help wasn't really about fairness. It was just about circumstance. Basha had it hard. I didn't. I want to tell you that I saw all of this clearly at 17 and made peace with it through wisdom. I didn't. I made peace with it through busyness. I got into Gannon University 20 minutes from home, majored in legal studies, worked 2 jobs to cover what my small scholarship didn't, and built a life that required so much of my attention that I simply didn't have room left to resent my cousin. Resentment, I've come to believe, needs idle time to grow in the way mold needs damp. I kept myself too dry for it on purpose without ever admitting that's what I was doing. I met my husband, Marcus Hale, during my second year at Gannon, in a study group for a business law class neither of us needed for our majors but both of us had taken because the professor was well regarded. Marcus was an engineering student, patient in a way that felt almost stubborn, the kind of person who read instruction manuals for fun and never once, in the 14 years I would come to know him, raised his voice at me. We married when I was 26, in a small ceremony at St. Casimir's that my mother cried through and my grandmother approved of, and Aunt Basha attended 40 minutes late, with Dominic as her plus one, both of them slipping into the back pew during the vows. We had our daughter, Josephine Josie, 2 years later. My mother adored her instantly and completely, in the specific devouring way grandmothers adore a first grandchild, and for a few years, that adoration did something I hadn't expected. It quieted the old resentments in me almost entirely. I watched my mother rock my daughter to sleep on the same porch swing where she used to rock me, and I thought this is what family is supposed to feel like. I let myself believe the imbalance of my childhood had simply been circumstance, whether nothing anyone had chosen on purpose. I was wrong about that, but it would take a ruptured appendix and 11 cardboard boxes to show me exactly how wrong. The ledger nobody kept. By the time I was 30, Uncle Tomasz had been dead 4 years, a heart attack in the garage of the house on 12th Street, the same house he'd rented for over a decade because he and Aunt Basha had never managed to buy one. Aunt Basha grieved him with a complicated grief, the kind reserved for people you loved and were also in some permanent way exhausted by. Dominic was 26 that year, drifting between jobs, a stretch selling cars, a stretch doing consulting that no one in the family ever fully understood, a stretch living in an apartment in Pittsburgh that ended, according to the story told at Sunday dinner, because of a landlord dispute, though Aunt Christina's daughter Marta later told me privately it had ended in an eviction. My parents helped Aunt Basha with the funeral costs for $1,000, my mother mentioned once, in the specific offhand tone she used when she wanted credit without wanting to seem like she wanted credit. They helped Dominic with first and last month's rent on the Pittsburgh apartment. They helped again when the Pittsburgh apartment ended. Each time my mother framed it to me the same way. It's not charity, Rennie. It's family. That's just what you do. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that because this isn't a story about a woman who was always strong. I didn't argue because arguing felt petty measured against a widow and her struggling son, and because I had by then a husband, a young daughter, a mortgage of my own, and a job that paid well enough that I told myself I didn't need anything from my parents anyway. That was true. I didn't need anything. What I wanted, though I didn't let myself examine the want too closely, was simply to be seen as equally worth investing in. Not because I needed the money, because I needed the proof. I got a version of that proof, or thought I did, at my grandmother's 80th birthday party, the summer I turned 31. Zofia stood at the head of the table in Christina's backyard. Under a string of lights Walter had hired someone to hang, and made a small speech, the kind she liked to make at these gatherings, thanking God for her family and her health and her grandchildren, each one of you a blessing in your own way. She looked right at me when she said the word steady. She looked right at Dominic when she said the word trying. I told myself that was fair. I told myself I preferred being the steady one. I have thought about that word steady many times since, because I now understand it was never entirely a compliment. Steady meant the one we don't have to worry about. And the one we don't have to worry about is, eventually, the one whose needs stop getting counted at all. I didn't know yet that my parents kept a mental ledger that never once, in 30 years, ran in my favor. I wouldn't know it fully until March of the year I turned 34, in a hospital bed, with my mother's hand patting a quilt that no longer covered my bed. The spare key. The escalation, when I look back on it now with the calm distance of hindsight, didn't begin with the hospital. It began 2 years earlier on a Sunday in April with a spare key and a text message I almost didn't notice. My mother had always kept a key to my duplex. I'd given it to her the year Josie was born, in case of emergencies, the ordinary kind of trust between a mother and daughter. I didn't think much of it until the day I came home from picking up Josie from preschool, and found my mother's car in my driveway, and Dominic's Corolla parked crookedly behind it. Inside, I found my mother in my kitchen, unpacking grocery bags, and Dominic sitting at my table eating a sandwich he'd apparently made from my own bread. "Oh good, you're home," my mother said, like this was a plan I'd been part of. Dominic's between places again. I told him he could stay in your basement for a few weeks, since you've got that pull-out down there, and you're never even down there. I stood in my own doorway holding my daughter's hand and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. A feeling I would come to recognize, over the following 2 years, as the specific sensation of being informed of a decision rather than consulted about one. Mom, I said, you can't offer my basement to someone without asking me. I'm not offering it forever, Rennie. Just till he's back on his feet. You have the room. That's not the point. Don't make this difficult. He has nowhere else. I want you to notice the way I eventually learned to notice the shape of that sentence. He has nowhere else was not, technically, a lie. Dominic had, in fact, been asked to leave his previous apartment for reasons that were never fully explained to me. But he has nowhere else was also doing a very specific piece of work in that conversation. It was converting my ordinary right to control my own home into an act of cruelty if I exercised it. If I said no, I wasn't protecting my family's privacy. I was letting my cousin sleep in his car. I said no anyway. It was, I think now, one of the harder sentences I'd said to my mother in a decade. He can't stay here. I have a 4-year-old. I don't know his schedule, his habits, anything. This is my house, not a way station. My mother's face did the thing it always did when I disappointed her, not anger, which I could have met head-on, but a soft, wounded confusion, as though I'd spoken a language she didn't recognize coming out of her own daughter's mouth. I don't understand why you're being like this, she said. Family helps family. Dominic, to his credit, or perhaps to his strategic advantage, I've never fully decided which, didn't fight me on it. It's fine, Aunt Helena, he said, standing, brushing crumbs off his jeans. I didn't want to impose anyway. He said it in a tone calibrated exactly to make me the one who felt bad, and it worked a little even though I knew it was working while it was happening. That was the thing about Dominic that took me years to fully name. He never had to lie. He only had to let a room's assumptions do the lying for him. He ended up staying in my parents' basement for 6 weeks that spring. I know this because my mother mentioned it to me at least 4 times, each time in the tone of a woman reporting a minor inconvenience she was bearing with grace. He's very neat, actually, she told me once. Not like you'd think. I didn't ask what she'd thought. I want to mark this moment clearly because it's the first entry in what would become, without my planning it, an actual ledger, the kind I would eventually build with real documents and real dates. April 14th. The spare key. The basement offer I refused. I didn't write it down at the time. I only remembered the date because it was the day before Josie's 4th birthday, and I remember being angry that I'd had to spend part of it defending the boundaries of my own house instead of blowing up balloons. The birthday envelope. The pattern repeated itself in smaller, quieter ways for the next year and a half, each instance too minor on its own to justify a confrontation, each instance part of a shape I could feel more than see. At Josie's 5th birthday party, held in my parents' backyard because it had a better fence for the bounce house we'd rented, my mother handed out cards to each grandchild present: Josie, and Anya and Marta's kids, and Dominic's daughter Layla, who was 3 by then, the product of a relationship with a woman named Priya that had ended before Layla turned 1. I noticed, because I have always noticed things like this, that the envelope my mother handed to Layla, from Grandma and Grandpa, was thicker than Josie's. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was petty to weigh envelopes at a 5-year-old's birthday party, and in a sense it was. But I also, later that night, quietly counted the bills in Josie's card while Marcus loaded the dishwasher, and found $40. I didn't have access to Layla's card, obviously, and would have never gone looking. But 2 weeks later my mother mentioned to me on the phone, entirely without prompting, that she'd given Layla $100 because Beija's on such a tight budget these days, and that little girl needs school clothes. I didn't say anything about the discrepancy. I filed it. I didn't yet know I was filing things. I only knew that a small cold part of my mind had started keeping count, the same way I'd count billable hours at work automatically without conscious effort, because that's simply what the trained parts of my brain did with information. There was the loan for Dominic's truck. In the fall I turned 30 to $8,000, my father told me proudly one Thanksgiving, so he can take the contracting job, get himself set up right. I asked carefully whether there was a written agreement. My father laughed. Rennie, he's family. We don't need a contract with family. I remember Marcus's hand finding mine under the table at that comment. A small silent squeeze that said, without words, I see it too. The truck loan was never repaid as far as I ever learned. Dominic lasted 4 months at the contracting job before a disagreement with his boss. The guy had it out for him. My Aunt Basha reported. Ended the arrangement. The truck stayed with Dominic. The $8,000 stayed unmentioned. A stone dropped into a lake, disappearing without a ripple anyone was willing to acknowledge. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make this story sound like 30 years of grievance I've been secretly cataloging, waiting for my moment. That isn't true, and it isn't fair to who I was during those years. I loved my parents. I still do. I believed, right up until the year my appendix ruptured, that whatever imbalance existed between how they treated me and how they treated Dominic was a temporary weather system, not a climate. I believed that because believing it let me keep showing up to Sunday dinners without dread. I believed it because the alternative that my parents had simply decided at some point in the deep past, that my needs were durable and Dominic's needs were urgent, and that durable things get to wait was too large a thing to hold while also raising a 5-year-old and working 60-hour weeks during tax season. So I filed the moments away instead of examining them. April 14th. The birthday envelope. The truck loan. I didn't know yet that I was building a case. I only knew that some part of me had started keeping a very quiet, very careful record, the way a good paralegal keeps a record. Not because she expects to need it, but because that is simply how her mind is built. The hospital bed revisited. Which brings us back to March and the hospital bed. And the moment I've already told you about my mother's hand on a quilt that no longer covered my bed. Her voice gentle as she explained that my room now belonged, in practice, to my cousin. I want to walk you through that day again more slowly this time because the first telling left out details that matter. I'd been admitted on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the infection from my ruptured appendix had spread enough that my surgeon, Dr. On Fam, ordered another 2 days of 4 antibiotics before she'd even consider talking about discharge. Marcus took leave from his engineering firm to be with Josie, and to visit me every evening after daycare pickup. Josie's small hand-drawn get-well cards taped in a row along the window ledge of my room. My mother visited Tuesday evening and again on Thursday. My father came once on Wednesday and stood awkwardly by the door the whole time, the way he always did in hospitals, a man who fixed boilers for a living and had never learned what to do with his hands in a room where nothing needed repairing. On day 6 Sunday my mother didn't visit. She called instead in the late afternoon, her voice bright in a way I'd later recognize as the tone she used when she'd already made a decision and needed me to agree with it retroactively. She told me Dominic's latest living situation, a room he'd been renting from a coworker, had fallen through. A phrase that, I would learn much later, meant he'd been asked to leave after failing to pay rent for 2 months. She told me he needed somewhere stable while he gets back on his feet. A phrase I'd now heard applied to my cousin no fewer than 6 times across 15 years, without the getting back on his feet part ever quite completing itself. She told me she and my father had talked it over and thought the sensible thing was to let him stay in my old room. Since you've got your own place now, and it's just sitting there collecting dust. It's not dust, Mom, it's my room, I said, though even as I said it I could hear how small it sounded, competing against my cousin's homelessness. You have a whole house, sweetheart. You don't need a room at ours too. I didn't have the strength that Sunday 9 days post-rupture, running a low fever, exhausted in the specific bone-deep way that only a body actively fighting infection can produce, to make the argument I might have made on a healthier day, that the room wasn't about need, it was about the promise attached to it, the specific promise my mother herself had made 100 times over the years. This will always be your home, Rennie. I was too tired. I said, do what you think is best, and hung up and cried for exactly 4 minutes, which I know because I watched the clock on the wall the whole time, and then I stopped because crying took energy I needed for healing, and because some part of me had already quietly begun deciding that I would deal with the actual meaning of this later, once I had the strength to look at it clearly. By the time my mother visited in person on day 8, the boxes were already packed. She told me this as though it were a mercy. I didn't want you to have to think about it, so we just got it done. And I understood, lying there with an 4 in my hand, that what she meant was, I didn't want you to have the chance to say no while you still had the strength to mean it. Dominic moved into my childhood bedroom on a Tuesday, the same day I was finally discharged. I know this because my mother told me, cheerfully over the phone, While I was still in the wheelchair, a nurse was pushing toward the hospital's front doors. "He's settling in nicely," she said. "You should see it, Rennie. He's got it looking so nice." I didn't go see it. Not that week. Not for a long time after. I went home to my own house, to Marcus and Josie and the leaking kitchen faucet I still hadn't fixed, and I told myself, the way I told myself so many times before, that this was a small thing, a practical thing, not worth the cost of a fight with a woman who just spent 9 days visiting me in a hospital bed twice. I believed that for almost 4 months. It was the discovery of the spreadsheet, though I didn't know to call it that yet, that finally made belief impossible. The garage. I finally went to look for my boxes in July, for months after the hospital, because Josie had asked me, out of nowhere one evening while I was tucking her into bed, whether I still had my old ribbons from when I was a kid, the ones Grandma always talked about. I realized I didn't know where they were anymore. I realized I'd never actually confirmed they still existed. I drove to Larchmont Avenue on a Saturday morning while my parents were at church, using the garage code I'd known since childhood, and found the 11 boxes exactly where my mother had promised, stacked against the far wall, behind my father's snowblower and a rack of paint cans in 6 different shades of green. They were dry at least. That much had been true. I opened the first box and found my books, thrown in without any order, spines cracked in places they hadn't been cracked before. I opened the second and found my school things, yearbooks, a shoebox of photographs, the folder of report cards my mother had kept every year of my education. I found the ribbons in the 4th box, wrapped at least in a plastic grocery bag, though the bulletin board itself had been broken down and its corkboard surface was cracked straight through the middle, a jagged white line running through 11 years of pinned memory. I stood in that garage for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think it's important not to sand down the ugly parts of a story like this into something more digestible. I didn't feel rage. I felt something quieter and, in its way, worse, a kind of clinical clarity, the same feeling I got at work when I found the sentence in a contract that revealed the whole document had never meant what the other side claimed it meant. I felt, standing in that garage surrounded by the disassembled evidence of my childhood, the specific and total absence of the word sorry. Nobody had said it. Not my mother, not my father, not Dominic. Nobody had framed the boxing of my room as a loss I might be allowed to grieve. It had been framed, from the very first phone call, as a practicality I should be grateful hadn't inconvenienced me more than it did. I took the 4th box home that day, the ribbons, the photographs, the report cards, and left the rest. I told myself I'd come back for it. I didn't for a long time, and I think that delay was its own kind of message I was sending myself, that I wasn't ready yet to decide what all of this meant, that some part of me already understood that once I decided, I wouldn't be able to undecide it. Thanksgiving revisited. Thanksgiving that year fell on my grandmother's actual birthday, a coincidence Sophia treated as a personal gift from God every few years it happened, and the whole family gathered at her house on Poplar Street the way we always had, my parents, Marcus and Josie and me, Aunt Basha, Dominic and Layla, Aunt Christina and Walter with Anya and Marta and their families, Uncle Henrik arriving late with his customary casserole. I want to describe one exchange from that dinner in detail, because it was the moment I first understood that the imbalance in my family wasn't a private matter between my parents and me. It was structural. Other people saw it too. Dinner was nearly over, the table down to coffee and the last of Zophia's Macaweek, when my grandmother raised her cup and made her customary toast, health, family, another year granted by God's grace, and then, as she often did, singled a few of us out for individual mention. She thanked Christina and Walter for hosting Easter. She thanked me. Our Renata, always so capable. A phrase I'd heard variations of my whole life and had long since stopped examining. And then she turned to Dominic and said, her voice softening in the particular way it always did for him, "And I want to thank Helena and Edmund for everything they do for Dominic and little Layla. Not every family takes care of its own the way this one does." The table murmured its agreement, the warm reflexive agreement of people who've said amen to this specific sentiment for years. I smiled because that's what you do, and reached for my coffee, and it was Marta, my cousin Anya's younger sister, 30 years old that year, sharp-eyed in a way our family had always slightly distrusted because she said things out loud that everyone else only thought, who spoke into the small silence that followed. "What do they do for Renata?" Marta asked. She didn't say it unkindly. She said it the way you'd ask a genuine question, curious, unweighted, and that was somehow worse than if she'd said it as an accusation, because it meant she wasn't attacking anyone. She simply didn't have an answer, and neither, in the pause that followed, did anyone else at the table. My mother laughed, a small uncomfortable sound. Renata doesn't need anything, she's got Marcus. She's got her career dash. That's not what I asked, Marta said, still gentle, still just curious. I asked what you do for her. Not what she doesn't need. Nobody answered. My grandmother changed the subject to the pie. But I sat there with my coffee going cold in my hands and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, something click into a shape I could finally see whole. It wasn't that my parents didn't love me. It was that love in my family had somehow become entangled with need, so completely that a person who didn't obviously need help had become, without anyone deciding it on purpose, a person who didn't require investment. I had spent 34 years being praised for not needing anything, and only now, at that table, did I understand what that praise had actually cost me. Marcus caught my eye from across the table. He didn't say anything either, it wasn't his family, and he'd learned years ago the particular etiquette of staying quiet in rooms that weren't his to referee. But I saw something in his face, a kind of grim solidarity, that told me he'd noticed the exact same thing I had, probably years before I let myself notice it. I drove home that night with Josie asleep in her car seat, and I said very little to Marcus and he didn't push me to. But somewhere on Route 5 in the dark, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. Actually counting. Not birthday envelopes this time. Everything. The truck loan. The funeral costs. The rent deposits. The basement offer. The bedroom. I didn't have exact numbers yet. But I had, for the first time, the beginning of an actual list, and lists in my line of work have a way of turning into evidence whether you mean them to or not. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever sat at a family table and realized, all at once, that a lifetime of small moments added up to something you'd never let yourself total before, stay with me. It gets harder before it gets better, but I promise you it does get better. Let's keep going. Christmas morning. Christmas that year was held at my parents' house, as it always was, and it was the first Christmas Dominic would spend as a resident of my old bedroom rather than a visitor to it. I noticed this before I even walked through the door. His boots by the mat, a coat that wasn't mine or my father's hanging in the front closet where my winter coat used to hang when I was a teenager. Small things. I trained myself by then to notice small things on purpose. Layla, 5 years old that Christmas, tore through wrapping paper in the living room with the particular joy of a child who doesn't yet understand that some gifts cost more than others. Josie, 6, sat beside her, patient in the way I'd raised her to be, and I watched my mother hand out presents from beneath the tree with a kind of pointed cheer that I recognized now as performance rather than simple joy. Josie's gift from my parents was a set of art supplies, thoughtful, a little expensive, $60 I'd guess, judging from the brand. Layla's gift, open moments later, was a tablet. Not a toy tablet. An actual iPad, still in its box, the kind of gift that made my Aunt Christina's eyebrows lift slightly before she caught herself and smiled instead. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest that this was, by then, a conscious choice rather than an oversight. I had decided, sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas, that I would stop reacting in the moment and start simply recording. I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of refilling the coffee, and I wrote the gift down in the Notes app on my phone, the way I'd started writing down other things over the previous month. Christmas Josie, art set, $60. Layla, iPad, $400 plus. I didn't yet know what I'd do with that note. I only knew that I no longer trusted my own memory to hold the pattern accurately, the way you don't trust memory to hold a contract accurately, which is why contracts get written down in the first place. Later that afternoon, while the men watched football in the den and Zofia napped in her chair, I found myself in the kitchen with my mother and Aunt Basha, drying dishes, and I heard my mother say something to Basha that she likely didn't intend for me to weigh as carefully as I did. I told Edmund we should just set up a savings account for Layla, she said, scraping a plate into the trash. For when she's older. College or whatever she needs. You don't have to do that, Helena, Basha said, though her tone suggested she very much hoped my mother would do it anyway. I want to. That baby's had it hard enough. My mother glanced toward the den, where the men's laughter rose and fell with the game. It's the least we can do. I dried a serving bowl very slowly and said nothing, but I noted the date in my phone that night once we were home. December 25th. Mom mentioned setting up college fund for Layla. No prior mention of similar fund for Josie. I want you to understand something about that note because I think it's the moment the story actually turned quietly on its axis. I wasn't angry writing it. I was, in a strange way, calm, the specific calm of a person who has stopped waiting to be proven wrong and started, instead, simply documenting what was true. My mother had never mentioned a college fund for Josie in 6 years of my daughter's life. She would mention one for Layla, unprompted, at least 3 more times over the following year. I wasn't imagining a pattern. I was watching one complete itself in real time, one Christmas dinner at a time. The meeting about the house. The clearest single event of that year, the one that finally moved me from quiet observer to active investigator, happened in February, 14 months after the hospital, at what my father described on the phone as just a family meeting, nothing to worry about. He asked me to come to Larchmont Avenue on a Sunday afternoon, and when I arrived, I found not just my parents but Aunt Basha and Dominic already seated at the dining room table, along with a folder of papers I didn't recognize and a man I didn't know, introduced to me as Gregory Ostrowski, a family friend and financial advisor my father had apparently been consulting. The meeting, it turned out, was about my parents' will and the disposition of the house on Larchmont Avenue worth, according to a recent appraisal Gregory had brought with him, approximately $210,000, fully paid off, the single largest asset my parents owned outside their retirement accounts. My father explained in the careful, rehearsed way of a man who'd practiced the speech in his car on the drive over, that he and my mother had been thinking about fairness, and that they'd decided the house would eventually be split not between me and Dominic equally, which I might have braced myself to accept even though Dominic wasn't their child, but along a formula that gave Dominic a 20% stake in the property, in recognition of how much he's helped out around here since he moved in, and because Basha doesn't have anything to leave him. I sat very still. I remember the specific physical sensation of that stillness, a kind of pressure behind my sternum, the feeling of a held breath, though I don't think I was actually holding my breath. I asked, in a voice I was proud of for staying level, "How much has Dominic put into this house? Financially, I mean. Not helping out." My father looked at Gregory. Gregory looked at his folder. "Well," my father said, "it's not really about a dollar figure, Rennie." "It kind of is though," I said. "You're describing a 20% ownership stake in a $210,000 asset. That's $42,000. I'd like to know what he's contributed that's worth $42,000. Dominic, to his credit, looked uncomfortable, the first time I'd seen him look genuinely uncomfortable in this entire saga, rather than performing discomfort for effect. "I didn't ask for this, Ren," he said quietly. "This was your parents' idea." I believed him, actually. I want to be fair about that because I think it matters to the honesty of this story. I don't believe Dominic sat down one day and schemed to take a piece of my inheritance. I believe he simply never said no to things offered to him, the way he'd never said no to anything offered to him his entire life, and that this passive acceptance had, over 3 decades, produced the exact same outcome as active scheming would have. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine, the same gesture she'd used in the hospital room, and I understood, feeling it, that I now associated that specific touch, warm, soft, well-intentioned, with the specific sensation of having something taken from me while being told I should feel grateful for how gently it was done. "We just want to make sure everyone's taken care of," she said. "You'll still get the majority, Rennie. You'll be fine either way." "I'll be fine either way." I've thought about that sentence more than almost any other sentence in this story, because I think it's the truest thing anyone said to me during the entire ordeal, and also the thing that finally broke something loose in me. She was right. I would be fine. I had Marcus, a stable career, a paid-off duplex we were slowly renovating, a retirement account I contributed to religiously. My parents weren't taking food from my table. They were taking something else, proof, the specific, tangible proof that 34 years of being the reliable daughter counted for exactly as much, in the final accounting, as a handful of years spent being the needy nephew. And once I understood that clearly, sitting at that dining room table with Gregory Ostrowski's folder open in front of me, I understood something else too. I was no longer going to find out what that final accounting looked like by accident in pieces at Christmas dinners and hospital bedsides. I was going to find out on purpose. "I need copies of everything," I said, nodding at Gregory's folder. "The appraisal, the current will, any drafts of the new one. I'm not agreeing to anything today, and I'm not signing anything today. But I want to see the actual numbers." My father looked startled. I don't think in 34 years I'd ever asked him for a document in that tone of voice, the tone I used at work, the tone that assumed the request would simply be honor because it was reasonable and I had a right to make it. Gregory, a professional accustomed to family friction, slid the folder across the table without waiting for my father's permission. I drove home that night with the folder on the passenger seat, and I didn't cry and I didn't call anyone to vent. I sat down at my kitchen table after Josie was asleep, opened my laptop and started a spreadsheet. I titled it, with the specific dry humor that I think is the only thing that got me through the following 8 months, Family Ledger. I didn't know yet how much I'd end up needing it. I only knew I was done relying on memory and goodwill to tell me the truth about my own family. The wedding invitation. Anya's wedding came that June. Aunt Christina and Uncle Walter's older daughter, marrying a soft-spoken orthodontist named David in a ceremony at a vineyard outside town that must have cost more than my first car. I bring it up not because the wedding itself mattered to the story, but because of what happened 3 weeks before it, when my mother called to ask whether Marcus and I could help out a little with Dominic's wedding attire. He doesn't have a suit that fits right, she explained. And you know how these things are, everyone's watching, and I don't want Basha to feel embarrassed. I want to note for the record that this was the first time in 15 years my mother had ever asked me directly to contribute money towards something for Dominic, rather than simply doing it herself and mentioning it afterward. I've thought about why that might have been, whether some part of her, after the will meeting in February, understood that I was watching more closely now, and wanted my direct buy-in this time, a kind of signature on the pattern rather than a bystander's silence. I said no. It was, I think, only the second time in my adult life I'd said no to my mother directly, cleanly, without immediately softening it. I'm not going to pay for Dominic's suit, Mom. If you and Dad want to get him one, that's your choice. But I'm not contributing. There was a long pause on the line. I don't understand what's happened to you lately, she said, and I heard, underneath the hurt in her voice, something that might have been the first flicker of unease, not guilt, not yet, but the dawning sense that the daughter who'd always simply gone along was no longer reliably going along. Nothing's happened to me, I said. I'm just done pretending I don't notice things. She didn't ask what things. I think, looking back, she already knew, and asking would have required an answer she wasn't ready to give. At the wedding itself, held under a white tent strung with the same kind of lights Walter had hung for Sophia's 80th, I watched Dominic in a suit my parents had, in fact, bought him. I recognized the fit, the newness of it, the fact that he kept adjusting the sleeves like a man and used to good tailoring, and I sat with Marcus and Josie at a table with Uncle Henrique, who leaned over at one point during the reception, watching Dominic make the rounds of the room, charming Anya's new in-laws. With the same easy laugh he'd had at 9 years old, and said quietly just to me, "That boy could sell sand in a desert and thank you for buying it." I laughed because it was funny, and because Henrique had a gift for saying the true thing in a way that let you laugh instead of grieve. But I also, later that night, added a line to my spreadsheet. Anya's wedding June. Mom requests I contribute to Dominic's suit. Declined. Parents purchased suit. EST $300 to $400. The spreadsheet had 11 entries by then. It would have 43 by the time I was finished. The hospital bill. The single largest entry in my family ledger came in September, and it came to my attention almost by accident through my cousin Marta, the same Marta who'd asked at Thanksgiving what my parents did for me, who mentioned it to me over coffee one afternoon in the tone of someone passing along gossip she assumed I already knew. "Did your parents end up covering Layla's hospital thing?" she asked, stirring sugar into her latte. Basha was telling my mom about it at book club. I hadn't known there was a hospital thing. Layla, it turned out, had been treated for a bad asthma flare-up in August, 3 days in the pediatric wing at UPMC Hammett, and the bill after insurance, which Beija's part-time job barely provided, had come to just under $6,000. My parents had paid it in full in a single transfer the week the bill arrived. I want to be honest about what I felt learning this, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like mine worth telling, rather than just another tale of a wrong daughter counting pennies. I felt first genuine relief that Layla was okay. She is a child, an innocent one, who bears no responsibility for any of this, and I have never once in the entire span of this story wished her any ill. And then underneath that relief, arriving almost simultaneously, I felt the specific quiet devastation of remembering my own hospital stay 18 months earlier, 9 days, a ruptured appendix, sepsis risk during which my parents had visited exactly twice and, as far as I knew, never once asked whether Marcus and I needed help covering the portion our insurance hadn't. I looked it up that night, pulling our old bills from the file cabinet in our home office. Our out-of-pocket cost after insurance had been $3,400. Nobody had offered to help. Nobody had asked if we needed help. I hadn't asked either, to be fair, but I also hadn't needed to ask in my understanding of how families were supposed to work, because I believed the offer was supposed to come first the way it had come first, unprompted, for Layla. I added the line to my spreadsheet with a hand that I noticed distantly was not entirely steady. September, parents pay Layla's hospital bill in full, $5,800, unprompted. March, 18 months prior. My hospitalization, 9 days, sepsis risk. Parents visited twice. No financial assistance offered or requested. I stared at that entry for a long time. It wasn't the money. I want to be completely clear about that because I think it's the single most important thing to understand about everything that came after. It was never about the money. Marcus and I could have paid 10 times that hospital bill without changing our lives. It was about the $6,000 being unprompted, automatic, generous, and my own hospitalization, with a genuine risk to my life, generating 2 visits and a conversation about giving away my childhood bedroom. I closed the laptop that night and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Marcus found me there around 11, and sat down across from me without turning on the light, the way he'd learned over 14 years of marriage, that I sometimes needed darkness to say hard things in. I think I need to actually deal with this, I told him. Not just note it down anymore. Actually deal with it. Okay, he said simply, the way he always said okay when I told him something that mattered. Not a question, not a warning, just a landing place for me to stand on. What does dealing with it look like? I didn't know yet. But I knew for the first time since the hospital 18 months before, that I was finally ready to find out. Layla's graduation, and a voicemail I wasn't meant to hear. Layla graduated from kindergarten the following June. A small ceremony in a church gymnasium, construction paper caps. A slideshow of the year set to a pop song none of the parents recognized but all of the children did. I went because my mother asked me to, because Josie liked playing with Layla despite the 6 years of family tension neither girl was old enough to understand, and because I had by then made a private decision to keep showing up to these events even as I quietly built my case. I didn't want my eventual reckoning with my parents to look, from the outside, like I'd withdrawn from the family in a sulk. I wanted it to look like exactly what it was. A woman who kept participating fully, right up until the day she had the full picture and could finally act on it. At the small reception afterward in the church basement, I went looking for a restroom and instead found my mother in the hallway outside the fellowship hall, phone pressed to her ear, her back to me, her voice pitched low in the particular register people use when they think no one can hear them. I know, Basha, I know. We'll figure out the school clothes, don't worry about it. No, don't ask Renata, she's got enough going on. I'll just move some money from the CD, Edmund won't even notice. It's fine, it's what family does. I stood very still in that church hallway, my heart doing something strange and fast in my chest. And I want to tell you honestly that what struck me hardest in that moment wasn't the money. By then I'd absorbed enough dollar figures that another few $100s for school clothes barely registered. What struck me was the phrase "don't ask Renata, she's got enough going on," delivered not as an insult but as an actual kindness in my mother's mind, a form of protecting me. I understood standing there that my mother had built an entire internal narrative in which shielding me from ever being asked for help was itself a form of love, while asking unprompted over and over for Dominic and Layla was also a form of love. 2 completely opposite behaviors both filed under the same warm word, and somehow in that architecture I ended up on the losing side of both. I didn't confront her in that hallway. I want to explain why, because I think it matters to understanding the kind of person I am and the kind of reckoning I was building toward. Confronting her there in a church basement at her granddaughter's kindergarten graduation would have felt good for approximately 90 seconds and then would have cost me everything I'd built over the previous 4 months, the calm, the documentation, the careful unwillingness to let this become a story about a hysterical daughter making a scene. I have never once in this entire story raised my voice at my family. That wasn't an accident. It was a strategy chosen deliberately, because I understood something my mother never seemed to grasp. The person who stays calm is the person whose version of events other people eventually believe. I went back into the fellowship hall, found Marcus and Josie by the punch bowl, and smiled, and ate a piece of graduation cake, and drove home that evening with a new certainty settling into my chest like a stone dropping to the bottom of a lake. I wasn't looking for more evidence anymore. I had enough. What I needed now was a plan. I texted my old law school friend Priyanka Deshmukh, that night, a family law and estate attorney I hadn't spoken with in almost a year, since her own wedding where I'd been a bridesmaid. "Are you free for coffee this week?" I wrote. "I want to ask you something and I think I need an actual professional answer, not just a friend answer." She wrote back within the hour. "Always. Tuesday work?" Tuesday worked. It would turn out to be the first of many Tuesdays that changed the shape of my life. The shared photo album. The discovery that changed everything didn't come from digging. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. I never hacked an account, never went looking through my parents' things without permission, never did anything a court would frown on. It came from a shared family photo album on my mother's phone, one she'd set up years earlier so the whole family could upload pictures from gatherings, and which she'd asked me that October to help her clean up because her phone kept telling her it was low on storage. I sat with her at her kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon, scrolling through 9 years of birthdays and holidays, deleting duplicates and blurry shots, and somewhere in the process my mother handed me her phone and asked me to also check her email, because I keep getting notifications and I don't know what they mean, while she went to answer the door for a delivery. I wasn't snooping. Her email was already open on the screen in my hand, and the notification banner sitting at the top, the one she'd asked me to explain, was from a bank, a CD maturity notice, the kind of automated alert anyone with a certificate of deposit receives when it's about to roll over. Beneath it, in the inbox, visible without my clicking anything, was a chain of forwarded messages between my mother and Gregory Ostrowski, the financial advisor from the February meeting. Subject line, estate planning walk family consideration. I want to tell you honestly that I hesitated. For maybe 10 seconds, phone in my hand, my mother's footsteps still audible at the front door. I genuinely weighed whether opening an email that had already loaded onto the screen in front of me, unprompted, at her own request that I manage her inbox, crossed a line I didn't want to cross. I decided it didn't. I wasn't searching, I wasn't guessing passwords, I was looking at what was already open, and I read it. The email was dated 14 months earlier, February, the same month as the will meeting. But it wasn't the meeting I'd attended. It was the planning that had happened before it, the part none of us had been shown. Gregory had written to my mother laying out 3 scenarios for the house, one where I inherited it fully, one where it was split evenly with Dominic, and the one my parents had ultimately chosen, and presented to me as though it were already decided rather than one option among several, where Dominic received the 20% stake. My mother's reply, sent 2 days later, read in part, "I think 20% is right. Renata will understand, she always does. She's never been the type to make a fuss, and honestly I think it would mean the world to Basha and to Dominic to know they're really part of the family, not just people we help out. Edmund agrees." I read that sentence 3 times, sitting at my mother's kitchen table, while she signed for a package at the front door 20 feet away. Renata will understand, she always does. I think I had, on some level, known this for months, known that my calm, my reliability, my refusal to make scenes, had somehow been quietly recast by my own parents from a virtue into a resource, a thing to be spent rather than honored. But seeing it written down in my mother's own words, sent to a financial advisor as a simple, uncomplicated fact about my character, did something that 18 months of birthday envelopes and hospital bills and boxed-up bedrooms had not quite managed to do. It made the pattern undeniable, not felt, not suspected, documented in her own handwriting on a date I could point to. I forwarded the email to myself. I want to be honest that my hand was shaking when I did it, and that I felt in that moment something closer to grief than anger, the specific grief of realizing that a parent's love, which you have spent your whole life assuming was unconditional and equally weighted, had in fact been quietly rationed according to a formula you were never shown. My mother came back to the table a moment later, chatting about the delivery, some kitchen gadget she'd ordered for Thanksgiving, and I handed her back the phone and finished deleting duplicate photographs, and I said nothing at all, because I had already decided in the 10 seconds between reading that sentence and hearing her footsteps return, that I would not have this conversation in her kitchen, reacting in the moment, giving her the chance to soften it with a hug and a promise to talk about it properly sometime. I would have it on my terms when I was ready, with everything laid out so plainly that there would be no room left for anyone to say I'd misunderstood. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes before I went inside. And when Marcus asked me over dinner how the visit had gone, I told him the truth. I found what I needed. I think I'm ready to talk to Priyanka about next steps. The decision. I met Priyanka at a coffee shop on State Street the following Tuesday. The same shop where we used to study for the bar exam prep courses neither of us had ended up needing in exactly the way we'd expected. She listened to the whole story, the bedroom, the truck loan, the 20%, the hospital bills, the email without interrupting, taking small notes on a legal pad out of old habit, and when I finished she sat back and said gently, "Okay, first I want to say none of this makes you crazy. I want you to hear that clearly because I know you, and I know you've probably spent a year wondering if you're overreacting." I hadn't realized until she said it how badly I'd needed to hear exactly that sentence from someone outside my own family. Legally, she continued, there's not much you can do about a will that hasn't executed yet. Your parents are alive, it's their asset, they can leave it to whoever they want, and no court is going to intervene in that while they're competent adults. That's not a fight you can win, and honestly, I don't think it's the fight you actually want. Then what is the fight I want? I asked her, and I meant it as a real question because by that point I genuinely didn't know. She thought about it for a moment. I think, she said slowly, you don't want to inherit fairness after they're dead. You want to be treated fairly while they're alive. Those are really different goals, and I think you've been treating this like an inheritance problem when it's actually a boundaries problem. I sat with that for a long time. I want to tell you honestly that it took me several more weeks and several more conversations, not just with Priyanka but with Marcus, with my therapist, Dr. Elaine Foss, whom I'd started seeing that autumn ostensibly for work stress but had increasingly used to untangle exactly this to fully understand what Priyanka meant and to accept it. Dr. Foss asked me in one of our sessions that November, a question that I've carried with me since. What are you actually afraid will happen if you tell your parents the truth about how this has felt? I answered without thinking, which is usually how you know you've found the real answer. That they'll say I'm being dramatic. That the whole family will agree I'm being dramatic. That I'll become the difficult one, the one who ruined Thanksgiving instead of the steady one. And that once that happens I won't be able to take it back. And if that happens, she said, what do you actually lose? I thought about it for a long time. A version of my family that I don't think has been real for a long time anyway, I finally said. Just an accurate picture, instead of the story I've been telling myself. That was, I think, the actual turning point of the entire 18 months. Not the hospital, not the email, but that sentence spoken out loud in Dr. Foss's small office with its beige couch and its box of tissues I'd never once needed until that moment. I understood finally that I wasn't afraid of losing my parents' love. I was afraid of losing the comfortable fiction that it had always been distributed equally, a fiction I'd built my entire adult identity around maintaining. Letting that fiction go felt for the first time like the actual cost of finally being honest, and I decided sitting there that I was willing to pay it. I talked to Marcus that night after Josie was in bed at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat frozen after learning about the hospital bill. I want to do this properly, I told him. Not an explosion at Thanksgiving. Not a screaming match. I want to lay it all out calmly with everything documented. Somewhere they can't turn it into a scene where I'm the unreasonable one. Okay, Marcus said again, that same simple landing place. What do you need from me? Time, I said. And the truck on the Saturdays I need to go through the boxes in the garage. And for you to tell me honestly if I'm being unfair to them at any point, because I don't trust my own read on this family anymore. I need someone outside it to keep me honest. He reached across the table and took my hand. You've been more than fair to them for 34 years, he said. I think it's time somebody was fair to you. I didn't cry, not then. I'd done most of my crying already in small increments, over 18 months of birthday envelopes in hospital hallways. What I felt instead, for the first time since March of the year before, was something that had been entirely absent from this whole ordeal until that moment. A sense of forward motion. Not revenge. Not even really justice in the dramatic sense the word usually implies. Just the quiet, steady sensation of a woman finally deciding to stop absorbing costs silently and start, calmly and carefully, presenting the bill. Building the case. I spent the following 3 months doing what I do best professionally, Applied for the first time to my own life. Building a file. I finished the spreadsheet properly, no longer scattered notes in my phone but an organized document with columns for date, event, amount and source, cross-referenced against bank statements Marcus and I pulled for our own hospital bill, against the forwarded email from Gregory Ostrowski, against photographs of the birthday envelopes I'd started discreetly taking a picture of whenever I was present for the exchange, against a printed copy of the property appraisal my father had given me in February. 43 entries by December spanning 19 years, though I limited what I intended to actually present to the 18 months since my hospitalization. I didn't want this to look like a lifetime grievance list, even though privately I knew it was. I wanted it to look like what it actually was. A clear, undeniable pattern, recent enough that no one could claim they'd simply forgotten the context. I went back to the garage on Larchmont Avenue on a Saturday in January, this time with Marcus and his truck, and retrieved the remaining boxes while my parents were again at church, not sneaking exactly, since I still had the garage code and every right to my own belongings, but timed deliberately so that the retrieval itself wouldn't become an argument before I was ready to have the argument I actually wanted to have. I went through every box at home over the following 2 weekends, cataloging what remained, noting what had been damaged or discarded. A box of childhood art projects was simply gone, my mother would later tell me apologetically, thrown out by mistake during the packing, and setting aside the ribbons carefully for Josie, who hung them in her own room with the solemn pride of a child inheriting something important. I met with Priyanka twice more, not to build a legal case since she'd been clear from the start there wasn't much of one to build while my parents were alive, but to help me understand my actual leverage, which she pointed out wasn't legal at all. It was relational and practical. "You're not trying to win a lawsuit," she told me. "You're trying to reset the terms of a relationship. The documentation isn't for a judge. It's so that when your mother tries to tell you that you're misremembering, or that it wasn't really like that, you can hand her a piece of paper with a date on it, instead of arguing about your memory versus hers." I updated my own will and beneficiary designations that same winter. A decision Priyanka helped me make less out of any specific grievance and more, she said, because anytime you're clarifying boundaries with family, it's a good time to make sure your own house is legally in order. Marcus and I named a family friend, rather than either of our parents, as Josie's guardian in the unlikely event something happened to both of us, a decision that had nothing directly to do with the current conflict, but which felt, in the context of everything else that winter, like one more brick in a foundation I was quietly rebuilding to be sturdier than the one I'd grown up standing on. I also carefully began preparing the people I wanted in the room, or at least aware when I finally had the conversation. I called Marta in February, the cousin who'd asked the unanswered question at Thanksgiving, and told her in broad strokes what I'd found. She wasn't surprised. "I've thought for years that your parents don't see what they're doing," she told me. "I don't think they think of it as unfair. I think they think of it as necessary, and necessary somehow always excuses itself." I asked her if she'd be willing to speak honestly if it came up in front of the family, and she said yes without hesitation, which mattered to me more than I expected it to, a small steady confirmation that I wasn't inventing a grievance out of thin air, that other people in this family had been watching the same pattern for years quietly the way I had. I told my grandmother nothing in advance. I want to explain that choice because I debated it for weeks. Zofia was 79 that winter, still sharp, still the emotional center of gravity for the entire extended family, and I knew that whatever I eventually said would likely reach her regardless of what I did. But I also knew that Zofia's instinct, faced with any conflict, was to smooth it over before it could be fully spoken, to change the subject to the pie, the way she had at Thanksgiving, and I didn't want the truth softened before it had even been said once clearly out loud. I decided I would tell her myself afterward in a private conversation, rather than letting her absorb a diluted version secondhand. By February, a full year after the meeting about the house, I had everything I needed. The spreadsheet, the email, the photographs, the appraisal, and most importantly, a script I'd rehearsed with Dr. Foss until I could deliver it without my voice shaking, not because I intended to perform calm I didn't feel, but because I'd learned, over 11 months of therapy, that genuine calm was available to me if I prepared thoroughly enough that I no longer had anything left to be afraid of. Discovering in the moment, I already knew everything. There would be no surprises left for the confrontation to spring on me. Only the surprise, I suspected, would belong to my parents. I chose the setting deliberately. Not Thanksgiving, not Christmas, Not any holiday where an audience of extended family might turn the conversation into spectacle, or where a child's memory of the day might be permanently colored by it. I asked my parents to come to my house instead. On a Sunday afternoon in March, almost exactly 2 years, I realized only after I'd already picked the date, since the week my appendix ruptured, for what I described honestly as something important I need to talk to you both about. My mother asked over the phone whether everything was all right, a note of real anxiety in her voice that told me some part of her had already begun to sense that the daughter who never made a fuss was finally about to make one. "Everything's fine," I told her. "I just need an afternoon with you and Dad. No one else. Just the 3 of us." She agreed. I hung up the phone, sat at my kitchen table, and looked at the folder I'd assembled, printed copies of everything, tabbed and organized the way I'd organize a case file at work, and felt for the first time in 2 years something close to peace.